Hello. So, as many of you know, this year it turned out that Pesach ended up, the seventh day of Pesach is on a Friday, and the eighth day of Pesach abroad turns out to be a Shabbat. So this is going to create a gap between the parsha we read in Israel and a parsha we read in America for a few weeks until we get resynchronized in one of the double parshas that we do. So for this purpose, I'm going to give another Dvar Torah this year for Pesach, in addition to the one I gave last week. And I'm also going to be preparing the shir for the next week. And so you may find that on the blog, there's at MyDrash.wordpress.com, that there may be some sort of a gap in terms like an additional week ahead that you have MyDrash posts available. And so here we go with our second MyDrash post. And this time we're not going to talk about a specific midrash from the Tanchuma, as we also did not do last week, but rather I want to talk about something that Rav Kook Z talks about in the Haggadah, which is relevant to all of Pesach and also to, in general, to this idea, what happens in the story of the leaving Egypt. So, the Haggadah is built around a certain structure. The structure is what we call Metchil Bignut Umesayem B'Shvach, to begin with the negative aspects, with negative traits or sort of characteristics of the existence of the people of Israel, and end up with positive traits of that sort. And this structure appears twice. One of them is Avadim Hayinu Leparo B'Mitzrayim, and then Vayotzienu Hashem. So we start off being slaves and then eventually get freed. And the other one is that Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu Ve'achshav Kirvanu Hashem Le'avodato. That in the beginning we were idol worshippers, and over time God brought us closer to Him until we became the chosen people. So, one way to understand that statement is just to say that this is a chronological statement, and that we are beginning from the negative aspects to show how far we've come, to understand the journey that we've been through. But Rav Kook, or Rav Kook, he saw this transition as not only being a chronological one, and not only being one where there was a negative state and then you move to a positive one, but that negative state actually was necessary and required and important to reach the positive state. So it wasn't only that we moved in some sort of a linear fashion, that we were in a bad state and we moved to a better position, but that even when we reached that better position, we needed and we used the lessons we learned in the negative state to enhance our religious existence when the day came that we reached that positive goal. Now, this, I'll just say as an aside, is a very common thing to find in Rav Kook's writing. I am not an expert on Rav Kook. Let me just say this straight out. But I do know that Rav Kook was trying to, one of the things that he saw as a centerpiece of his thought was that what's called Achdut HaHafachim, the unity of the opposites, where he didn't believe that you should, he saw that basically every extreme has good things in it, and that Judaism, in his view, tries to somehow merge these opposites into some sort of a synthesis, which generates harmony. And so everything has its place. Okay, every force, every ideal, every idea has its place, and it's just that we need to find the exact proportion between every idea and its opposites or its counterparts in order to get sort of like the perfect existence. And that, in fact, he saw this not only as some sort of a abstract goal, but he saw that the history of the Jewish people was, in a sense, an evolution of this type. Okay, and many times the evolution was in the structure of Chol, Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodashim. Chol means mundane, simple, everyday. Kodesh means holy, special, and Kodesh Kodashim, holy of holies, which he understood as the finding meaning, finding holy meaning in the mundane. Okay, so since God is everywhere, then we would like to see God everywhere, but in practice in our lives we have distinctions between the mundane and the holy. And when we reach Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, we can actually see the holiness in everything that is around us. Of course, that's a goal that we all strive for. Everybody reaches to different degrees. So I'm not going to give too many examples over here of what Rav Kook meant by this, but let's just say that there's like this. You could think of it in a sense as one example of the way people grow. Okay, as human beings, how do we grow? And societies, how do we grow? So we start off with some sort of an intuitive understanding of certain things. Then we branch off to try and intellectualize and formulate cognitively the meaning of what it is that we intuitively understand. And then, if we really, really process this idea, then we can leave that intellectualizing, abstract, in a sense, removed state, and go back into that intuition, that instinct, that instinct of understanding, but this time in a more deeper sense. So, Rav Kook sees this, for example, in the story of creation of man, where there's a contradiction between the verses. First, it says that man was created with Eve back to back, connected as one entity, and then meaning it says that he created them both together, and that's how the MyDrash interprets it. They were connected together back to back, and then eventually we were separated, and now that we're separated, we joined together, but this time face to face. So what is that? How do we see his idea in this example? So when you're connected back to back, that's a very natural way to be connected, but it doesn't involve any kind of choice. You're simply created in this way, and that's who you are. Then you're separated. It's like that intellectualizing phase where you sort of take a step back and you make distinctions. You say, I am me and you are you, and you sort of break everything down into its components. And then eventually you join together again. You merge together again with that with your soulmate, and you become one again. But this time, even though you're again one, similar to what you were before, like in that instinctive stage, you're still doing it by choice, right? So now it's through understanding, post-intellectualizing phase, you join together and recreate that merge. So this idea he applies in many, many places, and some of these things are also applied in mystical spheres that I don't understand and don't claim to understand. But this is sort of like one of the biggest, one of like the central themes you can find in his writings. So, in a similar way, he found it important to show that a lot of things that we may see at first glance as negative or bad also have a positive aspect that is important. And here he did the same thing to it. He says basically that slavery that we went through was important for the day that we were free. And that worshipping of idols was important for the day that we became monotheists that worshipped an abstract God. So what does he mean? So with regard to the second point, he explains that the problem with monotheism, and the problem with, or the danger in monotheism, is that it's so abstract that it can cause you to disconnect from the world around you. You can be, you can philosophize and basically go off and be disconnected from the actual physical world around you. Rav Kook says in some places that the Torah specifically does not mention the world to come. The reason was because the idea of the world to come, of some goal at the end, is so powerful, as we can see in Christianity. That that's sort of the thing that they strive for in many writings of leading of Christians. That it, in a sense, can completely remove you from concerns and from relating to the world that is around you. Whereas paganism is very connected to the world around you. You, in a sense, worship the world around you, right? You either you're a pantheist or you're a paganist, and then you worship idols. You worship elements, the sun, the moon, different forces of nature. So Rav Kook says, we want a person to be a monotheist, but we don't want him to lose touch with reality. And so that long experience, those generations, where the people of Israel or the forefathers of Abraham were pagans, that period was important because it instilled in our character, in our genes, so to speak, in our social genes or religious genes, a very strong sense of our surroundings. And only through that sense of our surroundings can we then really fulfill our monotheistic side. But just that abstract religion of worshiping a formless God who is everywhere and everything alone would be too abstract and would cause us to disconnect too much from our surroundings, and so it's important. The second one, about slavery, we started off being slaves and now we came out to be free. Here he says a similar thing, which is a very, very nice idea, I believe. What is the importance of slavery? Well, as he points out himself, very soon after the people of Israel leave Egypt, they are required to once again go into bondage, and that is bondage under God. They're supposed to be God's. We are supposed to be God's servants. Perhaps the word slaves, the term avadim in Hebrew, can be understood, in different levels of intensity. Somewhere between a servant and a slave, depending on the context. And so we're supposed to go into servitude with God, and serve Him. At the same time, Judaism definitely puts on a very high pedestal the idea of freedom. First of all, we know that the basic tenet of Judaism, which is not shared by all religions, is that of freedom of choice. That a person has the freedom to choose between good and bad, and so even God doesn't doesn't control your decisions according to our belief. He may know by being omnipotent what your choices may be, but He will not force your hand in either direction, except for perhaps extreme cases. Also, we know that in terms of human slavery, while you can find in the Torah, you can find references to slavery, compared to what was at the time, it is much reduced. The ability, the control that a person has over slaves, both Jewish and non-Jewish slaves, is much reduced compared to what was common in that time. And so there's definitely a statement there about how slavery is not a positive thing. And so the idea of slavery is almost like an anathema to Judaism, it's sort of something that Judaism doesn't believe in, and over time is shed, even before the rest of the world did so. And so, what is the important? And at the same time, we're supposed to go into slavery or into servitude with God. So, Rav Kook says one of the important aspects of freedom of choice is to know when to choose to go into servitude. Is to know when you want to be a servant, because that frees you up from so many other things. He quotes a verse which appears somewhere, Al tira avdi Yaakov, do not fear my servant Yaakov. And there's a sort of mystical pun over here which I won't go into, but he's basically saying, don't fear my servant Yaakov. Because you are my servant, because we are God's servants, we have nothing to fear. Okay? So in a sense, by becoming God's servants, we don't have to fear anything else in our surroundings. Nothing, no other person, no other leader, no other threat can even touch us, because we're servants to God. And so that frees us. By being God's servants, we're free from all sorts of earthly, mundane limitations and threats. And other forms of slavery, basically. We're not We do not become slaves because we're always, our first and foremost obligation is to God. And so, what's the problem? The problem is that here you come and you want to give the Torah to an entire people, and that Torah is full with messages of freedom, yes? But where are they going to understand? Where are the people going to understand what it means to be a servant? Where are they going to get that frame of reference to help them understand when it's appropriate, and once it's appropriate, how does one behave? If you don't give people any kind of, if people only learn from their experiences and words aren't enough, they need to have a real, tangible experience to relate to when they think about their servitude to God. And so the Rav Kook says this experience, just like the experience of being idol worshippers, gave us some sort of a groundedness that in our sort of like social genome. So the period of being in Egypt and being enslaved taught us what it means to be a slave, so that when we want to be slaves, when we choose to be servants, yes, and to sort of give up some aspect of our free choice by being obligated to what God tells us to do every day, then we will know what that means and we'll know how to behave in that context. And so to conclude, Rav Kook here presents, shows how, this process that we go through, in a sense, there's no, like to quote a verse from Barbra Streisand's song, there are no mistakes, just lessons to be learned. In a sense that, those periods where we look back and we say, oh, it was so terrible at the time, it maybe have been terrible, but we also learned something from them, something that we still carry today, and which is important for us, which is without it we couldn't have done what we did, we couldn't have become who we are today. Even in slavery and in idol worship, one can find something to import into monotheism, into a free monotheism, and to make it whole. So with that, I'll wish you a happy and enjoyable Pesach, and Shabbat Shalom, and see you on the other side in Parshat Shmini.